Ölgen kuchilarda Ümit üzme aziz halqim Ümit üzme ey ana yurt Biz atandık bu küreşke O yıl taştak uyuşup Allah berse bu nusretni Bizgilerimiz sep bulup Zalimlarni yığlatgudek Oğuz gibi küçlük bulup Lepildeydu asminimda Göz yaknitip şu günü Ay yıldızlık gök bayrağım Ey ana makam Ay yıldızlık gök bayrağım
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Dear brothers and sisters, and welcome to another special episode of Talk is Turkestan, where we've got a special guest. We're going to be talking about her book. As you guys have seen in the ad, I have with me today Miss Amelia Pang. Now, a little bit about Amelia. Amelia is an award-winning investigative journalist of Uyghur descent. Her work has been published in The New Republic, Mother Jones, and the New York Times Sunday Review, among other publications. She's currently an editor at EdTech magazine. She's the author of Made in China, A Prisoner, an SOS Letter, and The Hidden Cost of America's Cheap Goods, which is the book that we're going to be talking about today, and which was shortlisted for the 2019 J. Anthony Lucas Work in Progress Award, co-administered by Columbia Journalism School and the Nyman Foundation for Journalism at Harvard University. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Amelia Pang to our show. How are you today, Amelia?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for having me.
No, thank you so much, and we really appreciate the work that you do. And I've congratulations. I've heard that you have a newborn.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. So before we actually get into your book, you wrote a very interesting piece where everyone can check out on Amelia Pang's Twitter account in New York Times. She basically writes about she found out about her Uyghur heritage through this image. And this is a very popular image, an infamous image going on of the Chinese concentration camps, so you can see Uyghur detainees. Amelia, before we actually get into your book, could you just tell us a little bit about yourself and your Uyghur heritage?
Yes, my grandmother was actually born and raised in Urumqi, and she knew the Uyghur language and culture. She was very that it hadn't been lost at that point. But just in one generation, my mother and all of her siblings completely lost the Uyghur heritage and identity and language, and it just wasn't passed down. And there's a complex list of reasons why that was the case. But what happened to my family was one of the earlier cases of just completely being of Uyghur descent, but completely losing access to that part of your heritage, and partly due to the fact that it's just so hard to be a Uyghur in China. You face so much discrimination. You have a hard time getting jobs. Even before the rise of the massive amount of concentration camps, it was very difficult to survive as a Uyghur, so, but unfortunately, what happened to my family is going to be a very common story with a lot of Uyghurs today and their later generations, due to just the intensifying of the forced assimilation policies. But I didn't have time. I didn't have enough a word count in my New York Times essay to go into this. But actually, I wanted to mention the first time that someone really said to me, you look very Uyghur. I mean, you have the Uyghur nose, you know, it's very distinct. It's different from Chinese. Um, and it's kind of problematic that you don't really identify as Uyghur and know much about the Uyghurs. The first time that really happened was in around 2015 when I interviewed Rabia Kadir. She was the first Uyghur I had ever met in my life. Because I was born in the U.S. and grew up in the U.S. And, you know, my entire life I have been told that I am Chinese, and that is pretty much it. Um, and I always I always was on some level conscious of the fact that I looked quite different from other Han Chinese, full-blooded Han Chinese people. I was, you know, in the summer I would get just very tan very easily. I never got sunburned because, you know, the Uyghurs are, you know, that you're used to living in a desert environment. And, you know, my hair texture tend to be more wavy than the Han Chinese straight hair. And, you know, my eyes and my nose were a little different. Like my whole family just looked a lot different from other Han Chinese people. But for some reason, we only identified as Chinese, and I always kind of felt like an outsider, even among the Chinese American population in the U.S. And so I'm sorry, this is a really long-winded way to tell this story.
Yeah.
But so
Yeah.
meeting Rabia Kadir in 2015, and when she told me, that was a powerful moment for me, because when I first saw her, the first word she said to me was, "You are a Uyghur, and do not forget that. Don't let them make you forget that. Don't let them take that away from you." And, you know, that was really a shock to me to hear those words, because your whole life you had been told you're just Chinese. And so I didn't really quite come around to it, or really make any efforts to learn the Uyghur culture or language until really I saw that photo of the concentration camps that you showed earlier, where you see just the rows of Turkic people, and you see their distinct features, their nose, their eyes, and I saw my own facial features in that photo, and that just really hit home. That image, just that was the moment I finally understood Rabia Kadir's words to me several years ago, and
Wow.
made more effort to definitely take Uyghur language classes and learn more about the culture and history, because me not knowing anything about the Uyghur heritage is complicity to a genocide, essentially. That's how I felt when I saw that image of the men in the concentration camps.
Before we actually get into with the interview with the book, I would like to urge everyone to hop onto Amazon and purchase the book, have a read, and she covers a lot of issues. And again, with the labor camps, this is not a new issue just happening with the Uyghurs. This has been going on for decades, and which we will highlight that today as well. So I urge everyone, not just Amazon, but just wherever you can, just try and get the book. So let's get straight into it. In 2012, a mother from Oregon named Julie opened up a package of Halloween decorations, and from the cheap phone headstones, there was that was bought for $5 at Kmart. A deal too good to pass up. She found an SOS letter handwritten in broken English by a prisoner who'd made and packaged those cheap items. How did the world find out about this prisoner, and how did he end up in a labor camp?
Yes, so she told the media, and that story went viral. And that's what my book explores: what happened to him in the
Yeah.
end. How did he land in a labor camp? What were his experiences there? But I also really wanted to explore just the problems in our supply chain
Yeah.
all the different factors that made it really easy for something that was manufactured in a labor camp in China to end up selling at a Kmart in Portland, Oregon. Um, so, and a lot of that does tie in with our complicity as Western consumers, the way that we shop, the brands that we support, and the sourcing practices that we also contribute to that make it really, really easy for and lucrative for factories to secretly outsource work to forced laborers, like the Uyghur forced laborers.
As you mentioned, we're going to get into that, how we as consumers, we are definitely a huge part of this. I mean, if we were to, I mean, we constantly call for boycotts, but we'll sort of get into that soon. There seems to be a hidden system contributing to China's economy, these modern day gulags that we have seen, and even before, telling the human stories of those who are in labor in these camps. Made in China, your book reveals how it is the exploitation of political and religious dissidents that makes it possible for not just Americans, but everyone to pay low prices. When we purchase products in China, not only are we not only are our spending habits hindering social progress in China, but we are also, as you've said, we're sort of supporting slave labor, aren't we?
Yes. And I know there's been a lot of efforts to try to start campaigns to ban or to stop shopping from made in China products, to just completely avoid all made in China products. But I don't know if that is the best strategy to go, because it's very overwhelming for the average consumer to hear that everything is made in China, even if you want to avoid it. A lot of things are only made in China these days. And even if it says made in the US or made in India, a lot of times the raw materials could be made in a labor camp in China. Right now, we're hearing stories about how the Uyghur forced laborers are making raw materials for solar panels. That's a big problem. These prison camps are making raw materials. So I think something that maybe a better actionable step that we can take as consumers is to start asking our companies, our favorite brands, and start demanding them to reveal the specifics of their sourcing practices. It's not enough to just list a name, just provide a list of their Chinese suppliers. They also need to list exactly how much they're giving the Chinese suppliers to make that product. We need to know if that Chinese supplier can realistically make that product for that cheap of a price, or do they kind of have no choice but to outsource work to labor camps sometimes because they just can't make it in-house and pay workers' wages that way. Or another thing we should be looking for are corporations giving Chinese suppliers enough time to make their product, or are they trying to capitalize on the latest trends and make as much profit as possible, have the product be made as fast as possible? And when the production deadline is too short, a lot of factories have no choice but to outsource work to forced laborers who can stay up all night to make the product that they have to. There's nobody looking out for them. And I think those two factors do tie in with us as consumers. We do tend to support the companies that can offer the lowest prices, who can offer the latest trends. And so I think that also ties back with maybe a need for a shift in our consumption culture. Do we really need to buy that latest fashionable item? Or can we start shopping more on a need basis rather than a want basis?
Yeah, so as I mentioned before, a lot of the blame is placed on the consumer. I mean, it's still, even when you're talking to everyday people, they don't really care, or they don't simply know. And even if they do, they know, they're like, oh well, that's just the way it is, and that's really sad. And we wonder. I mean, we've had discussions on our show. We talked about, well, why don't these companies just move, to other countries, India, Bangladesh? But as you mentioned, those raw materials could still be sourced from, forced labor, and then what's to say that those companies within India, Bangladesh, or other Southeast Asian countries just don't go ahead and make their own profits and still profit from, forced labor in China?
Absolutely. It's very hard to document. But I think one thing we can start doing is I know your audience is probably already doing this, but a large part of the world's population have not really done anything to call out those 82 brands that the Australian Strategic Policy Institute found using Uyghur forced labor associated with the Uyghur Labor Transfer Program. That report was pretty damning, and it was revealed a year ago. And to this day, not many of those brands have actually dropped those suppliers. So one of the goals with this book is to actually push push other demographics in addition to the Uyghurs to start really boycotting these specific companies. I think it's just not good enough that if we do have information that your suppliers are associated with a labor camp and you still don't drop that supplier after all this time, then that just sends a really bad message to China, because it just shows that the world doesn't care. They can continue to have these camps. The corporations are not willing to pull out.
As I mentioned at the beginning of the show, right now we're talking about the Uyghurs with their forced labor. But could you just tell us about the history of forced labor in China overall? When did it start? How did this come to be?
Yes, forced labor, I'm sure many of your audience already know, have a very long history in China. It actually, the earliest camps, well, actually, corvée labor existed in ancient China as well, in the dynasties. But this kind of mass detainment of political prisoners really started with the Chinese Communist Party, even as early as the 1930s, before they formally took control. As they were gaining momentum, they were collecting political prisoners and forming these makeshift labor camps that were based off of and inspired by Soviet gulags. So these are, even the earliest ones were pretty horrific, where there was a lot of torture, and because that was the earliest basis for these camps. But since the 1930s, these camps have only expanded. Before the Uyghur re-education camps, there's so many other camps that they have all kinds of innocent names, right? Just like the Uyghur camps are called vocational training centers, these other labor camps are called compulsory isolation drug detox centers, or pre-trial detention centers, even legal education centers. All of these names sound benign, but these are really extra-legal detention centers where anybody can be thrown in there arbitrarily without being sentenced in court. They don't have access to lawyers. They're kind of held indefinitely. There's a lot of torture and a lot of sexual violence that happens in these facilities, and the detainees there often have to work 15 to 20 hours a day, and they have to manufacture products all over the world. Most of them are working with exporters, because that's extremely lucrative for the camps to do so, and there's not much stopping them from working with exporters.
As you mentioned, it's been going on for a long time. I remember when I was younger, I would see stories of those the sweatshops with Nike, and I remember they'd have it'd be on 60 Minutes or it'd be on some current affairs show, and then it'd sort of disappear, and then we go back to buying just buying those products again and just living our lives. What's it going to take for us to change? Because as human nature, we're going to want the cheapest and the best, and as you mentioned, the quickest. But I still think if governments don't put in legislation for those products to come in, then we wouldn't be able to purchase those products. Am I right in saying that? Or is there more to it than just simply governments banning products? Because, for example, I believe a few months ago, 13 tons of hair was blocked at customs. And obviously from that, you're not going to be able to purchase, quote unquote, Xinjiang hair anymore. What can the government do besides come up with legislation and bills and in your mind?
That's a great point. I think each of those bans are impactful in a small way because the more that we can take trade from China regarding how lucrative these camps are, then that to a certain point that will push the Chinese government to rethink its policies. Because we have to remember it was ultimately trade that sparked these mass arrests of mass detainment of Uyghurs, right? It's all connected to the Belt and Road Initiative. My book does cover how the rise of the Uyghur detainment camps really are closely aligned with the Belt and Road Initiative investments. China just wants to protect trade in that region at all costs. It's such a important transportational hub, the East Turkestan region for the China's $1 trillion economic development plan. So there's a lot of money there, and if we can hurt China's bottom line by taking bits of trade away from them, then that could be what compels the Chinese government to release the Uyghurs. And as for what consumers can do, going back to the Belt and Road Initiative. So as your listeners probably already know, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act is really key to calling legislators, building momentum to get that passed. Because if you could ban all products from the Xinjiang region, then that would be a big blow to the Chinese government. They just invested so much money in developing that region as an economic zone. So that is key. But another thing that consumers can do that I think can create change, because at the end of the day, we have to remember it can feel hopeless. It can feel like people are just never going to change. But we have to remember in the 90s, there was a lot of, and my book does cover this more, that there's a lot of momentum to boycott the sweatshops that were associated with Nike. And that it was just all over the universities. There were many people holding protests all over the world. And, while it didn't hurt Nike in the long run, but it did scare a lot of corporations. And they really started doing audits then. That was when they started auditing their Chinese suppliers and releasing some information about what they found in their audits. That kind of transparency was unprecedented. That didn't exist before these protests. So consumers can influence change, even if it was only a small change in the 90s. But I would argue that we need to go even further. It's not just it's not good enough for the factories to conduct audits. And my research in the book found that a lot of the audits that the Chinese suppliers are currently undergoing are extremely, extremely flawed. They're designed to protect the corporation more than the actual workers. They can't actually detect if there's forced labor in the factory or if they're subcontracting to forced labor a lot of the times. Some really comprehensive, more expensive audits can, but most cannot. And I even interviewed Chinese auditors who have told me this. During my decades-long career, I know these factories are using prison labor, but I cannot prove it because the things that we have to look for in our audit just cannot prove that. And so we as consumers can really start asking our corporations to start revealing more details about your audits. What kind of audits are you conducting? And are your audits really able to detect forced labor? If not, can you implement changes in the way that you do audits to make it harder for the factory to subcontract to forced labor? And because if it's no longer profitable for the Chinese factory to use forced labor, then they're not going to use them, right? Because there's so many Chinese suppliers, and they're also competitive with each other. If one of them can get a contract with a big brand like Nike or H&M or any of these brands that are found to be using Uyghur forced labor, that they don't actually want to do anything that could potentially cause them to lose that contract. They're willing
Yeah.
to go at all lengths to keep that contract, even if it means outsourcing work to forced labor to get the job done. But if companies start showing, okay, we want to really put our foot down, and we're serious about you not using any forced labor in your supply chain. And if it's too much of a risk for the factory to use forced labor at that point, then they're going to have to stop. And then if it's no longer so lucrative for the Chinese government to use forced labor, then we can really start to see the tide change then.
May I remind our audience that, guys, please post your questions. We've got some really good questions coming up soon. I'm going to ask a few more questions to Amelia, then I'm going to share some questions from our audience. Now, you experienced this firsthand, and in early 2019, you traveled to some of these camps, incognito, obviously, as a business person, and you realized how easy it was to sort of take on those services in those facilities. And the people there were really quite open about, yeah, we are making people work from prisons.
Yes, yes. And just to clarify, I didn't go to East Turkestan because it is very hard to actually visit the camps in East Turkestan. But the camps outside of East Turkestan, like the drug detox centers that are actually reopened re-education through labor camps, they're very accessible. Oddly, I was very shocked to find that. I would just show up at the camps. I'd start a conversation with the guards or an employee on their way to work, and just say, oh, I'm with an overseas company that wants to source from you. And they were very open in terms of telling me what they made inside, that there were prisoners making products inside, and they offered to, show me around the camp and drive me around. They're very, very used to working with business people from the West, or people associated with businesses from the West. And it's not even actually very hidden very well if you really want to find this information. If I as an individual journalist can document this, then these corporations of millions of dollars can find out a lot more than what I was able to. But it was just mind-boggling just how productive these camps were, in terms of, you saw freight trucks going out of the camps every 2 hours or so, and carrying massive amounts of shipments. And I followed a lot of these trucks to see exactly which suppliers they were working with. And because it's not hidden very well, if you just follow the trucks, you can see their relationships. And they were working with an Apple supplier. They were working with an exporter that made children's school supplies. They were making products, materials for bike brakes that were being exported. And you see this factory's name, you have their address, and you can I looked up their customs records to see exactly what they were shipping and where. And they were shipping to the US, they were shipping to Europe, they were shipping all over the world. And this kind of information is traceable if the corporations really wanted to find out. And if we as consumers say that we would like you to start really looking into this information, really start monitoring your factories, maybe even having people follow the trucks that leave your factories to see exactly who are they working with. Are they working with your approved factories, or are they working with prison camps? If you wanted to find this out, you can.
Wow. Let's get a question. We have a question from a Uyghur activist here. I'm not sure if you've seen her, but she normally protests on the streets of Boston. She asks, what's your opinion for me as an activist on how to stop this? She goes, she's protested in front of Apple for 5 weekends, planning to now target Nike. She feels it's effective. Many Americans support her. Can you offer any other advice for her? She's obvious, and she's been contacting elected officials as well.
I think those are all terrific steps. Just make sure to also try to publicize what you're doing as much as possible. Maybe get outlets like, BuzzFeed, or these kind of viral media outlets to cover your story and to really document it. And I think just the more more pressure you can build, because one person protesting outside of Nike, maybe it's not that much pressure to them, but having it go viral on social media is quite threatening to their PR image. And so really try to get that your story to go viral if possible.
You've obviously seen those stories where Uyghurs are interviewed from these camps. And you've been to similar facilities, obviously not in East Turkestan, as you mentioned. But when you see those clips, I mean, one, did you get, when you went to those facilities, did you get a chance to interview workers? And if so, or if not, well, did you get a chance to interview workers or no?
So since I'm not actually with any kind of corporation, I
Yeah.
was nervous that if I actually went in the camps and looked around and talked to them for a long time, they would know that I'm
Yeah.
actually a journalist. They would be able to tell that I'm not from the industry. So I didn't actually dare to go into the camps, but so my research focused more on following the trucks to see exactly which exporters were working with the camps. And I just got the guards to acknowledge that there were prison labor inside. But yes, of course, those it's a joke. The dancing Uyghurs and the happy workers. There's even like pictures on Getty Images of prisoners. I believe it's Qingpu prison. You know, doing nice activities on Christmas and being treated very well. You know, China's put a lot of efforts into putting up a facade that the people in here are not doing forced labor and they're having very nice lives. But I don't think anybody is actually fooled by that.
I've got another question here. Says being a Uyghur is really hard stuff in the current situation. Hard situation. How did you overcome the bias on Uyghur identity and bravely try to find your Uyghur identity back?
Well, I live in the
Yeah.
US, so it's a very different situation. It's a lot more
Mm.
multicultural. You don't have this policy to create a single state race that the China is trying to do. That's a very odd concept in the US, a single state race.
Mm.
So I personally don't feel that kind of discrimination in the US. So it's much easier for me to begin to search for my roots compared to my relatives in China. You know, I do have relatives who actually put Uyghur on their national identity card. And, and now it's so hard for them. Every time they go on the subway, or go on the high-speed rail, immediately the police will come find you, and have a talk and just say, hey, how's it going? Just wanted to let you know we're here. Just wanted to let you know that we're watching you, basically. It's an extremely, extremely, in that environment, it's really hard to even dare to Google anything about Uyghurs in China.
Yeah, you can't Google everyday Uyghurs cannot tweet, and yet you have. I'm sure you've seen the videos of everyday Uyghurs making reaction videos to Pompeo's statement on his labeling of genocide, and we're thinking, well, how did you get onto YouTube? How did you translate it in English and then be spread everywhere? So technically, those Uyghurs are committing a crime. And each time CGTN or any pro-CCP journalist or minister is tweeting, they're committing illegal acts, technically.
Yes, but are those Uyghurs committing a crime, or do they have a gun held to their head?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. We've got another question here. Do you think that Uyghur culture can be fully revived among Uyghurs at some point in the future, as some elements have been lost with Chinese rule? I assume they're talking about, the ones that are under Chinese rule.
Under Chinese rule, that is a hard question. I don't think I have an answer to that, but I do feel hopeful. Just the Uyghur diaspora has been flourishing. I didn't have enough word count in my New York Times essay to go into this, but I was able to learn a lot about the Uyghur culture and language through the Tarim network, which many of you might be familiar with. They
Yes.
are a terrific network where they offer even free lessons for anybody that wants to learn the Uyghur language and culture. And it's weekly lessons. They're really terrific, done by experts. And for anybody, for any Uyghur that felt like they've lost the Uyghur language and heritage because due to forced assimilation policies or whatever reason, you can find them and have great access to free online lessons. And and it's things like that that really will keep the language and culture going and help revive it.
We just had someone join in the middle and say, what is the name of your book? So I'm reminding everyone, name of the book, Made in China, A Prisoner, an SOS Letter, and the Hidden Cost of America's Cheap Goods. You can get that on Amazon or wherever you buy your books. Before I let you go, Amelia, are there any final words that you want to share with us?
I know it's very disturbing what's happening at camps now and what's been happening historically, and my book does cover a lot of that. But I wanted to emphasize that my book is ultimately about the actual steps we can do to really create change, whether that means really pushing for corporations to do better audits, or as consumers removing a lot of the factors that make it lucrative for Chinese suppliers to use forced labor. There are specific things that we can do, and I am hopeful that we can create change.
Okay, thank you so much, Amelia, for giving me your time. I know you're very busy. And thank you very much to our audience. Let's keep the conversation going. Keep on talking about this. Again, as we've always talked about, it seems dim. It doesn't seem there's a lot of hope, but change is coming, and we believe that as well. Again, thank you very much. And until next time, everybody, make sure to share and with your friends and family. It does make a difference. Until next time, everyone. Sorry?
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Arslan.
You're very welcome. Anytime. And I hope to have you in the future as well to discuss many other issues. Until next time, guys. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa
Ümit üzme aziz halkım, ümit üzme ey ana yurt. Biz atlandık bu güreşke, o yıl taştak uyuşur. Allah verse bu nusretni, bizgilerimiz sep bulur.